those of you who don't know me, maybe this is the first time you're logging into one of these webinars, but my name is Monica McConkey, and I have a private practice called Eyes on the Horizon Consulting. My practice is really focused on rural mental health, rural behavioral health issues. And most of the folks that I work with are farmers and ranchers and their families. So I'm very embedded in serving the rural population. And as I was saying at the outset of the training, part of my contract with the state that brings you these trainings is also, it allows me to come out to rural areas and do outreach and education or trainings around behavioral health topics. So if that is something you are interested in or your organization is interested, just be in touch and we'll see what we can get lined up. I'm excited. I'm going to Bottineau next week to do an in-person QPR training at the college there. First time I've been up there. So definitely looking forward to that. It looks like the weather will be fine. So that's always a plus too in February. Okay, so today we're going to be diving in to exploring the impact and the link between trauma and chronic stress on chronic disease. And when I first did this presentation for, I think it was like an asthma prevention coalition in Indiana, something like that. And they wanted to look at asthma or chronic disease in general through a bit more of a behavioral health lens to look at, are we really addressing through our prevention efforts? Are we truly addressing the risk factors that are bringing people to this point of experiencing chronic disease or needing treatment for chronic disease? So they were looking at it from a prevention standpoint and really were wanting to better understand how trauma and stress contributes to folks suffering from a variety of chronic diseases. So when I dug into this, I was like, oh my gosh, it just makes so much sense. It makes so much sense how these are all very linked together. But often in our treatment approaches, we're not great at looking like upriver at root causes. We are treating symptoms, right? And we know, I'm speaking to the choir here, we know that to make real change, we need to go upstream and we need to look at root causes and we need to look at prevention and intervention strategies. So those are some of the things we're going to talk about today. So we'll first jump in and just do really brief definitions of chronic stress, trauma, and chronic disease. We know that any one of the three of those could be a presentation all by itself. So these are just going to be really kind of brief definitions where we'll touch on what those mean in the context of what we're talking about today. Then we're going to dive into the understanding of that connection between chronic stress, trauma, and chronic disease, and then looking at, I would say, holistic approaches to improving well-being, because it's all of us, right? We can't separate out our mental health and our physical health, our social health, our spiritual health. It's all interconnected. And so we will be taking a look at that as well. Again, if at any time, let's just keep this super informal and throw questions into chat. I think you can all unmute. Let me just make sure. Yeah, I think you can all unmute on your own. If you have a question or if you have something you'd like to add, in no way am I the expert on this. So input, we have a lot of experience in this room, and any input or anything you'd like to add is awesome. And I think we have both behavioral health folks here, we have public health folks here, so a wide range of experience and knowledge. So jumping in, first thing, let's talk about chronic stress. What do we mean? So chronic stress is that prolonged, constant feeling of stress. So always in that stress response mode. It's not like we have a stressor and that stressor, whatever's causing it, maybe subsides, or we are able to implement coping strategies to calm. And so it's like the build up, the stressor, the calm. Chronic stress is really people feeling stressed over a period of time. So the stressors are experienced with frequency and intensity that our autonomic nervous system does not have an adequate opportunity to relax. We are always like geared up. We are always in like fight or flight mode. Our body remains in a constant state of psychological arousal. And obviously there are a lot of impacts from that, the physical toll, the mental, emotional toll of being in a constant state of psychological arousal. So when we look at in general, just our stress response, this is kind of how it goes. There's a stressful incident. And I think it's important to remember that it can be perceived. So we're thinking this might happen, or we're worrying this might happen. It doesn't even have to be something that's actually happening for it to kick off a stress response. So I talked to just kind of to demonstrate this. I had a client yesterday, and he, because of things in the past in his childhood, he learned how to be really hyper vigilant about reading signs in people to keep himself safe, honestly. And we'll get into ACEs here in a little bit too, which really is what I'm talking about. So fast forward, 25 years, he's now an adult. He's in a relationship with a fiance, and he is struggling right now because she comes home. He recognizes this like look in her eye or look on her face or some body language, and immediately he is triggered and his stress response kicks in. Nothing has even happened. It is his perception based on his history that she's mad at me, she's upset with me, she's going to leave me. And that kicks off this. It kicks off his stress response, even though there's nothing that's actually like taken place. He's just picking up that trigger. The trigger is the stressor. So what happens is immediately information is sent to our amygdala, which is a little almond-sized part of our brain. And that's where our emotions and our history are stored. And that processes and interprets information immediately. And it interprets it and processes based on our past, based on our history, based on our experiences. So then, depending on all of that, the danger signal is sent to the hypothalamus, which is the command center for our body. It communicates through our nervous system. So we feel in this time of kicking off, a stress response, we'll feel physically some things happening. Typically, our adrenaline surges, our heart beats faster, our pulse rate and blood pressure go up, our breathing becomes rapid and often shallow. Our senses become really sharp, so we're taking in the environment, and we're releasing glucose and fats to give ourselves energy. And this is what sends us into the fight or flight mode, which you've probably heard about. There are actually two more F's in that stress response. It's fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. And fight or flight is what we often talk about. My client last night, when this happens to him, so he sees the look on his fiance's face based on history stored up in his brain, in his amygdala, that is signaling to him, I'm in trouble here. She's mad at me. So the danger signal goes, he's having all these things happen physically, and it's automatic. And his stress response is fawning. So he will suddenly go into this mode where he's like, I'm gonna do dishes. I need to pick up the house. I need to like, what can I do to make things okay for you? Because I'm sensing like I'm in danger and you're mad at me. And we've made the connection directly back to how his dad parented. This is important to understand because for people in chronic stress, they're always on. Like they are in fight, flight, freeze, fawn mode ongoing. And what is not included in the number 3 there, all the things that automatically happen for us in a stress response, is thinking. Our thinking brain, our prefrontal cortex shuts off. Because in essence, when we're in danger, we don't really need it. We need our body to react. So the example I give, and the reason this is built in for us, and this is a very good thing, is if you were out in the pasture and a bull came charging at you, you would not need to like pick off your options. Like you would not need to think through pros and cons. You would not need to process. Well, A, I could lay down and play dead. B, I could run. C, I could get my phone out and call 911. We don't have to do that, thank goodness. We just react. And that's why this is built in as a life-saving mechanism for us. It's really a gift. However, most of the stress that we encounter on a daily basis is not life or death. But our brains don't know that. And so we get thrown into the same stress response as we do when it is like life or death. And all of these bullet points under number 3 happen. And then the fight, flight, freeze, fawn comes in. Unless we become really good at noticing the triggers and calming. Okay, so just wanted to talk that through so we have a good understanding of when someone is in chronic stress mode, like this is happening for them ongoing. So you can about imagine when we're talking physical stress and strain on our body, when our heart is beating faster, ongoing, when our pulse rate and blood pressure are up, ongoing, when we're constantly releasing glucose and fats, I mean, that's going to take a toll, right? All right. There is also something called the HTA axis, not access, axis, which is all about the hormones that get released. And it's like the gas pedal stays down. So the cortisol, it keeps flowing and it keeps us on high alert. Now, typically, as with a stress response, the threat passes, our cortisol levels drop, we can, breathe normally again, our adrenaline levels drop. However, chronic low-level stress ongoing keeps that activated like a motor idling too high for too long. So like RPMs are up for a long time, which would wear out an engine, right? Same with us. It wears us down. This also ties into the vagus nerve, VAGAS, or VAGUS. I think it's VAGAS. And I encourage you, if you work with people who like stress is something that is cueing off that fight, flight, freeze, fawn response, or it's impacting them behaviorally, a lot of anxiety. Do some research into the vagus nerve, which connects us, from our brain all through our senses, our lungs, our muscles for swallowing down to our stomach. It's all connected. That is why when we get nervous about something, we have a stomach ache or our throat tightens up. All connected, and it all ties into this as well. So vagus nerve, good thing to check out. So with this chronic levels of stress, we see increased blood pressure, which of course will eventually possibly lead to increased risk for heart attacks and strokes, and a buildup of fatty tissue. So that's kind of the stress piece. All of this very blends together, but I separated them out just by purpose of definition, I guess, so we can talk about each one separately. Then we get into trauma. Now, trauma is something that, gosh, there are whole multi-day conferences on trauma, right? So we could really spend a lot of time talking about this. I'm just going to really briefly hit on definition of trauma. So trauma is defined as an emotional response caused by experiencing distressing or traumatic emotional or psychological events or event. It can be singular or plural. Now, trauma can look very different for everybody based on a lot of things, based on their support system, based on resiliency factors, that two people can go through identical things and not have the same impact at all. One really brief story is when I was 5, our parents, we lived on the farm and we experienced a tornado. And so this tornado, I remember like getting up during the night, my door wouldn't open. And so mom had to kind of like kick my door to get it to open because of the pressure of the tornado. And, it's very vivid, very vivid. This is all stored in my amygdala. And we got down in the basement and it's loud and it's noisy. And, they kind of sheltered us in a corner and put some things over us. And it was scary. Now, I had a brother and sister that were not too far from me in age that were right next to me experiencing the same thing. For many years into adulthood following that event, anytime the weather was on and there was a red box, like tornado watch or tornado warning, I went into stress response mode. Anytime the day was hot, sticky, humid, I would be feeling anxiety. I don't anymore, but for years I did. My sister, nothing. She barely remembers the day. She has no distress around weather. It's not really a thing for her. So we have to be careful that when we look at trauma, we're not judging, I guess, like if it's relevant for a person or not, because it's very personal. It's based on perception, past experiences, and their level of feelings of like powerlessness during that experience. So there's big T trauma and little T trauma, lots of definitions around that. This is just a snapshot. So trauma is often caused by things that are really that surpass someone's ability to cope with them. So things like abuse, neglect, accidents, sexual violence, combat experiences, and natural disaster. So we can talk about types of trauma in terms of acute and chronic. Acute trauma is an emotional response that happens during and after a single distressing event. So let's say like my tornado example. So it was acute. I had that one experience, but the fallout was over the course of time, right? Even though it was a single episode. And then there's chronic trauma where people are traumatized multiple times. So years of abuse, years of neglect, years of exposure to combat experience, let's say in war. We have first responders who see and hear and experience things over and over and over. So it is repeated distressing events. Okay, then we get into chronic disease. Chronic disease is characterized as conditions that last 1 year or more and require ongoing medical attention, or they limit the activities of daily living, or both. Okay, so that's kind of the dictionary definition of chronic disease. Conditions that last a year or more, require ongoing medical condition, and or limit activities of daily living. So interestingly enough, 6 in 10 adults in the US have a chronic disease. Over half. 4 in 10 adults in the US have 2 or more chronic diseases. That's incredible. Very high numbers. So we have 40 people, just for sake of easy math, we have 40 people on this call. So if I'm calculating correctly, 24 folks on this call have a chronic disease. 16 folks on this call have 2 or more chronic diseases. That's impactful. That's significant. So chronic diseases, what are they? They are things like heart disease, cancer, diabetes, stroke, chronic lung disease, Alzheimer's disease, and chronic kidney disease. And I have some North Dakota stats I'll share after a bit from the CDC. They used to have this nice, like, put in your state, put in what you want, and they'll give you this nice graph. And boy, I tell you what, I spent far too long trying to figure that out. I think they changed it. And so I'm just going to do a little screen sharing to look at those numbers. So let's look at major risk factors. So when we talk about major risk factors for chronic disease, let's just go to chat. What do you think they are? What do you think major risk factors for chronic disease are? So looking at these: heart disease, cancer, diabetes, stroke, chronic lung disease, Alzheimer's, chronic kidney disease. What do you think? What are some ideas that you think are the major risk factors for developing these chronic diseases? And again, you can send it to me only if you want it to be confidential. So we've got diet and smoking, overweight, smoking, alcohol use, exercise or lack thereof, right? Stress, family history, grief, interesting one. Family history, stress, genetics, family history. Good list. Any others? Any other thoughts or comments? What are the risk factors for chronic disease? Lack of sleep, diet? Any others? These are good. They all play into it, don't they? Lifestyle choices, the environment that we live or we're raised in. Any others? Economic status. Interesting to look at like socioeconomic disparities when it comes to chronic disease. Lack of medical follow-up, lack of proper health care. So think about our rural state. Think about North Dakota and how far people travel for health care, the lack of follow-up, lack of insurance. How does that play into it? Transportation. Good list, you guys. Okay. So some major risk factors, you named it. These are the top major risk factors that the CDC, Center for Disease Control, identifies. So we've got tobacco use, poor nutrition or diet, as you said, physical inactivity, and excessive alcohol use. So according to the CDC, these are the 4 top major risk factors for developing a chronic disease. Think about these 4 things in terms of folks who are struggling with mental health. So let's look at some North Dakota stats. Yeah, coping mechanisms. Yes, Chelsea, you are right. They are coping mechanisms, all 4 of these. So when we talk stress response, when we talk trauma, all 4 of these tend to be coping responses, right? We'll get into that. Okay, so let's look at some North Dakota stats. Again, I could not pull up my handy dandy little graphs, which I've done before, and I think they changed the deal and I wasn't smart enough to figure it out. So I'm going to do a screen share and hopefully this works okay. So we're going to look at North Dakota stats. Okay, this is just kind of a snapshot of leading causes of death in 2017 in North Dakota. And I like this one because it compares us to the US rate. So in North Dakota, heart disease, leading cause of death in 2017, we were 44th state rank, 137.8. This would be 137.8 deaths per 100,000 people, if I'm reading that correctly. Let me see. Age adjusted. Okay. And US rate is 165. Cancer, second leading cause of death, rate in North Dakota is 142.6. US rate 152.5. So we're below the national average for heart disease and cancer. So going to Alzheimer's above the national average, chronic lower respiratory disease, a little below the national average, accidents, stroke as a chronic disease, 35.4, diabetes, a little bit above the national average, suicide, which is not a chronic disease, but it's figured into leading cause of death, significantly above the national average, which ties into what we're talking about. And kidney disease is just right at national average. Let me see if I can pull up. If you're still able to see my screen, we can look at some others here. So this is asthma. And North Dakota is in the lower percentages for asthma, which is awesome. Oops. I don't want to do that. Yikes. Okay, let's look at a couple others here. Let's look at cardiovascular disease. If you're not seeing my screen, let me know. So North Dakota, again, is one of the lower numbers in the country. Let's look chronic kidney. And these are, when you see these numbers, these are cases per 100,000. Okay, chronic kidney disease, we are really high. So North Dakota is in the highest percentage for deaths for chronic kidney disease. Let's see what else. Let's look at diabetes. Mortality due to diabetes, it's in that 82 to 91.7 for every 100,000 people. So it just gives you a snapshot, and I encourage you to go on here and do some digging around. If you're ever writing a grant or requesting funding, this is all really good information that can help. So here we have cigarette smoking among youth. So we're getting into our risk factors. North Dakota, high, one of the highest states. Let's look at cigarette smoking among adults. This is a current as of 2019. Again, in the higher category, ties into asthma. So you can go through here and I can send you this link, or I think it's at the end of my resources. Alcohol use. Let's see where North Dakota is on that. We can about guess. This is by youth. So we're in that 26 to 27.8 percentage. So over a quarter of our youth. And then let's look at binge drinking among adults. And then we'll keep going with the presentation. So no surprise, right? We're in that dark blue, the highest age-adjusted prevalence of any states. Isn't that interesting? Those upper Midwest states. So I just share that with you to kind of get to know your state, your data, and how it contributes to the chronic disease issues that you see in your work. And then, of course, that points to the prevention intervention piece. So let's make some connections. We've got this information. We've seen some statistics. Let's make some connections. Whoops, I am apparently record there. Okay. So think about ACEs when we're talking about this. Any response to stress results in elevated cortisol levels in the brain. And the more severe or prolonged the stress, the longer those elevated chemical levels in the brain persist and affect not only the brain, but also the body. So for a developing brain, for our kiddos, at an early age, such prolonged elevated chemical levels can cause adverse, even permanent changes to various systems in the body, immune system, digestive system, as well as the brain, potentially impacting memory, attention, and emotions. So we have that connection with stress and impact on mind and body, brain and body. So let me back up. For those of you who aren't familiar with ACEs, it is an adverse childhood experiences study. So ACE, for some reason, I'm getting some feedback here. So ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, was done in the 80s by Kaiser Permanente, which was like an HMO insurance company in California. And they selected a group of adults. And the purpose was to see if what happened to you as a child impacts your health as an adult. And so the things they asked about were, did you as a child experience physical, emotional, or sexual abuse? Did you experience physical or emotional neglect? And in your household, were there household members that experienced mental illness? Did you have relatives who were incarcerated? Was your mother treated violently? Was there substance abuse occurring in your household? And were your parents divorced? Okay, so they looked at these as key factors of adverse childhood experiences. This then led to findings. Oh, my slides are being funny. Okay, so it led to findings that if people reported that as a child, yes, these things happened to me, the more ACEs, the more checks in the box of those things happening, the greater their health risk as an adult. So what they found were people that experienced adverse childhood experiences, abuse, neglect, household dysfunction. They had greater incidence of lack of physical activity as an adult, greater incidence of smoking as an adult, of alcoholism, drug use, and missing work. They also had greater instances of obesity, diabetes, depression, suicide attempts, STDs, heart disease, cancer, stroke, COPD, and broken bones. It's like, talk about the link between adverse childhood experiences and chronic stress and trauma on chronic disease. There are other studies that showed that childhood maltreatment, so children who were abused or neglected, was associated with inflammation in adults 20 years later. And we know that inflammation in our bodies is a significant contributor to chronic disease and cancer. And this quote is from a study that's published in the National Library of Medicine. And it says, childhood traumatic stress increased the likelihood of hospitalization as an adult with a diagnosed autoimmune disease decades into adulthood. These findings are consistent with recent biological studies of the impact of early life stress on subsequent inflammatory responses. So as a child, the stress levels and the trauma experience have impacts well into adulthood in terms of chronic disease and inflammation, cancer. So when we think about what we call diseases of despair, or you've heard deaths of despair, those are things like drug and alcohol overdoses, suicide, liver disease. These are all connected with the high risk factors, right? They are also connected with liver disease and drug and alcohol overdose with chronic disease. So when we look toward prevention and intervention for chronic disease, I encourage you to look more broadly. So there are some really awesome programs out there that exist and are making a difference. When we look at, there was one stat for North Dakota I looked at, I want to say it was around smoking and how those numbers are dropping, even in light of like vaping among our youth. So there are programs, prevention programs out there that are doing good work and they're meaningful. One question I got when I did this presentation in Indiana was really around, do we keep doing what we're doing? Is it making a difference? Because the feeling was we're not going upstream and looking at these potential root causes, like the adverse childhood experiences. But you know what? It makes a difference, because if you are intervening with an adult to help them with their coping strategies, with lowering risk factors, with getting good ongoing treatment for chronic disease, you're making a difference for the next generation. So it all ties together. By working with the adult, you're lowering, hopefully, adverse childhood experiences for their kids or the kids they have influence over. So it all ties together. And this in no way means that you should stop doing what you're doing, because it matters. I'm just throwing out some things to maybe look at it in a different light, like how these connections are happening and how can we use that to impact the reduction of chronic disease in our communities. So before we start on prevention and intervention, any questions on what we covered up until now, kind of that connection piece, risk factors, stress, trauma? I'll just pause for a second. So we're still doing very, very good on time. Okay, not hearing anything or seeing anything coming through, so we'll just keep going. Okay, so when we look at prevention and intervention in terms of, vagus nerve, any suggestions of places to learn more or books, I will send you some links afterwards. I can send you a copy of these slides, and I'll send you some links on some sites I've used around the vagus nerve. It's really fascinating to read about and how like our cross body motions help calm the vagus nerve. So when we're talking about, well, adults and kids, but especially kids, I did this presentation for a group of kids actually in North Dakota. And we were talking about how to calm when when our stress response is really kicking off. So this is a little segue here. And a lot of it is work around the vagus nerve, if we can work to calm that. And much of what research is showing is the value in like cross body movement, like drawing figure eights, walking in figure eights, marching with a hand, to your opposite knee. And it was so interesting for me to watch this group of kids, because the kids who were the most dysregulated during the presentation, so bugging their peers, not able to sit still, turning around, they were moving, they were talking, they were being disruptive. When we came to the activities, and I said, okay, stand up and like march in place and touch your opposite hand to your opposite knee. Those kids that were the most dysregulated, it was all this, no cross body. It really took them focusing to get that down. And so it really just started to click to me how it's like the cross body brain connection works to calm that vagus nerve, which then calms, from your brain throughout your whole system, your nervous system, your organs. So very fascinating to see, and fascinating to see more and more research coming out. But I'm working with two OTs in Emmons County, we're going to be doing a parent presentation, staff presentations on just exactly that, like things you can do to help your child calm. And they are on it. I mean, those two OTs in the school district that are already doing work there, they do a lot of the, I think they called it brain games. I don't remember the term now, but a lot of the crossbody, linking arms, walking in figure eights. It's really fascinating. So back on track here. The paradigm shift that is helpful for us to look at when we're working with people instead of the what's wrong with you is that whole concept of what happened to you that brought us to where we are today. And like my client yesterday, he truly feels stupid for having this response or reaction to his fiance's seemingly meaningless facial expression or look in her eye. And she initially confronted him about it in terms of, what is wrong with you? I am fine. I'm not upset with you. There's nothing wrong. Why do you keep asking me? Now that he's gaining understanding and he's able to share with her, that conversation is really turning to understanding what happened to him that is leading him to have that kind of stress response. It's also relevant when we're talking about like those 4 risk factors. Like, why is someone finding solace in substance use? Why is someone finding solace in emotional eating? Like, what happened to them? So if any of you have heard of the book, there we go. Thank you. I'm going to get your name. Well, she sent it to me anonymously, so I won't say her name. But someone just recommended a book called What Happened to You? Conversations on Trauma, Resilience, and Healing by Bruce Perry. And I've got it on my shelf and I've got it as an audiobook because it is, I first started listening to it as an audiobook and it was really a lot. And so I bought the book so I could mark it up. But amazing information in this book. So it's called What Happened to You? Conversations on Trauma, Resilience, and Healing. It's by Dr. Bruce Perry and Oprah Winfrey. Really fascinating. And one of the stories in there that really connects, and this is going back a little bit, not so much the chronic disease piece, but the piece about understanding like what happened to you in terms of, why am I doing the things I'm doing? Why am I having the stress response I'm having? Why am I experiencing things as an adult that I'm experiencing? One of the stories in that book that really stuck with me was this kiddo, really difficult childhood. I feel like I'm not recalling specifics, but you'll get the gist of it. Was in foster care, really a handful, you could say, very emotionally dysregulated, got kicked out of school regularly. And so ended up in a fairly stable, secure foster home, seemed to be fine, started a new school, seemed to be doing fine. And suddenly he got a new teacher and was just thrown into dysregulation, ripping up the room, and nobody knew what happened. Nothing had changed at home. There was this new teacher that they seemed to have an okay relationship, but this kiddo was having this huge response. And so Dr. Perry had been involved in the case, and he had previously sat in on a supervised visitation with this kiddo and his bio dad, who had been the source of his abuse, trauma, neglect. And this had happened, you know, some time past. And so when he started to have all these problems in this classroom, Dr. Perry went into the classroom to just observe and consult. And the first thing he noticed was that the cologne that that male teacher was wearing was the identical cologne that that kiddo's dad was wearing. That he picked up on that because he was in that supervised visitation. That sensory trigger was stored in that little boy's amygdala. And so when that trigger of smell became apparent with this new teacher, he reacted. He went into fight mode. He did not even know why and could not describe why. So you can imagine somebody like that not understanding what's happening to them, going on into all of the stress that's going to happen through his growing up years, and often resorting to not positive or negative coping strategies, which are in turn the 4 highest risk factors for chronic disease. So the whole ACEs thing totally makes sense when you can just back it up and think about those connections. So when we're working with folks, it's important to have that paradigm shift in our mind that, you know, what happened to you? Where is this stress response coming from? Where is this coping strategy coming from? So it's all interconnected, the chronic stress and trauma with the physical impact, the elevated blood pressure, the risk factors. Okay, Aza just shared in chat the questionnaire for ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experience Questionnaire. Thank you, thank you. And then the psychological impact, it's all tied together. So important for us to look at that and not just see the behavior. Okay, let me see. So we have a comment too. Olfactory and other unidentified sensory triggers can be immense and sort of teleport a person back into a traumatic time. Absolutely. So think about your 5 senses: sight, sound, taste, smell, and touch. All of those memories and the attached senses are stored in your amygdala. They can be wonderful. Like if you hear a song that brings you back to just like, oh, the good old days of being a teenager, and you can reminisce and feel good about that. Or if you walk into a bakery and it brings you back to like, oh, walking to grandma's kitchen, it was such a good thing. It can be very positive. But if you hear a song that was playing at the same time you were sexually assaulted or abused or another trauma, those two are linked. Just like the smell that the little boy experienced with the cologne. And oftentimes it's so unconscious, we don't know why. But it brings us right back to a memory, and that memory can be positive or it can be really traumatic. And that will kick off a stress response, and we often don't even know why. Kids especially aren't able to put to words why this is happening. So people coming out of like domestic abuse situations, and they're in another relationship, and maybe it's a very positive relationship, but there's a word or there's an instance where something just hits them and they're transported back, and they have this reaction that's seemingly coming out of nowhere. It's completely about stress response and their brain trying to keep them them safe. Okay, let's keep going. Really good discussion. Keep throwing things into chat. So when we're talking prevention, we really want to focus on those protective factors. And this is nothing new or earth-shattering. This is like those good, solid protective factors that we know when we can surround people with and help them build these in their life, they are going to be at lower risk for long-term negative impact, right? So if we can work to lower risk factors and increase these protective factors, that is really good prevention. So I broke them down into different like segments, I guess. So the first is social protective factors. That is all about surrounding a person with good people around them. So when they're little, they have positive experiences with their caretakers. They're able to bond. They're able to trust people who are parenting, that we're giving them good support, because they in turn then will be able to be better parents and provide their kids with those protective factors. This is important in all developmental stages and all ages. How are elderly receiving good social supports around them? So think about that across the lifespan. So there's a lot of information coming out right now on isolation and loneliness. And I did a presentation just recently about that, so you may have heard it. But the Surgeon General in, I think, 2022 or early 2023 came out with a advisory, public health advisory on the impact of isolation and loneliness. And again, 100% tied into chronic disease and chronic stress. That the lifespan of people who are experiencing isolation and loneliness is shorter, that they're more apt to chronic disease and health issues. So it's all around that social support. So what are we doing to help our people, ourselves, our families, our kids, our clients access good, positive, supportive networks? The next is psychological protective factors. And this is all about that coping piece. So we know that the 4 highest risk factors, right? Alcohol, drugs, smoking, physical inactivity, poor diet, poor nutrition, all are negative or unhelpful coping strategies. So if we can help teach good, positive coping strategies and relaxation, managing our thoughts and emotions, it's never too late to learn that stuff. But if we can teach it to our kiddos, wow, they are way ahead of the game. Then we have our biophysical protective factors, and that is all those foundational, taking care of our physical self kinds of things. Eating healthy, accessible health care, getting sleep, moving our bodies, taking medications as prescribed, all of the things that keep us physically okay. And then 4th is spiritual protective factors. Where does our hope come from? How do we help instill that or develop that in our kids and youth? What feeds our soul? How do we have connection with that in our life? And we know that hopelessness is a huge cause of suicide, right? People feel like there's nothing for them in the future, that they have no hope, things are never going to get better. And so if there's something in their life that can instill hope, that can feed their soul, that can connect to them. And for some people, it is kind of traditional maybe religious church connections. For some people, it's being in nature. For some, it's volunteering. It can be a lot of different things, but it's important to nurture that or help others nurture that in their lives. So these four things all come together. You know, if we are pretty good at taking care of our physical body, but we really don't have supportive people around us, it's I mean, good that our physical body's good. We are still going to feel the impact on our physical health of not having good supportive people. So these all really are meshed together when we talk holistic prevention of chronic illness and chronic disease. Then we talk intervention. So interestingly enough, when you go to the CDC, bless their hearts, they're very good. I'm not knocking the CDC, but it's just like a little oversimplification. So when we look at CDC, they recommend don't smoke or stop smoking, eat healthy, be active, and limit your drinking. And it's like, okay, I will get right on that. I'm somebody who has a high ACE score. I have a stress response that's up here. I've experienced trauma. I've been negatively coping for years, but I will get right on that and do those four things. Not realistic, right? Like, yes, these are things we want to work toward to be healthy in all ways. But again, it comes back to the same things. So we can look at prevention and intervention in much the same way. And it's all about building protective factors, no matter our age, no matter our life situation. For people living in recovery from substance use, this is huge. They are increasing and developing and nurturing protective factors. Questions, comments before I move on? Nothing earth-shattering, right? It's just looking at what is behind chronic disease and how do we start to make an impact. And the big impact comes from protective factors that we surround our kids with and that we develop in our own lives. Gosh, are you sure there's no questions? Because it's like only 1:10 and we have until 2. These are resources. I will send these slides out and I will also send some links on the vagus nerve, and I'll send a link to the book, What Happened to You. I'm just jotting that down so I don't forget. Yes, questions, comments, feedback. Let me hear from you. Scoring the ACEs and what that score means. I can also give you that. So, you know, it's different. So I have heard or read studies where it's like if you have an ACE score of 4 or higher, so 4 or more things on that list that you can check off, like, yep, this happened to me, this happened to me, that you are at much greater risk for all of those health factors as an adult. However, I have friends who have ACE scores of 5 or 6, but because they have really worked hard to build protective factors in their lives, that the impact has not been as big as it could have or maybe even should have been. But I will get you info on ACEs, scoring ACEs, what that all means. Lorelei, I think it is really important to take time for yourself. I would agree with that 100%. Especially in this arena where people are caretakers of other people, that sometimes we really need to, I mean, all the time, we really need to look at ourselves. Okay, I have an anonymous message. Another good one. I've tried reading the book, The Body Keeps the Score, Brain, Mind, and Body in Healing Trauma by Bessel A. van der Kolk, MD. It's so fascinating, but it is a more difficult read. That is very true. So the book is The Body Keeps Score, Brain, Mind, and Body in Healing Trauma. Another really good one. Other questions, comments? Also, sharing resources. Let's keep going with that. If you've read something that you feel like is been helpful for you in understanding the stress, trauma, chronic disease connection, share that too. I will stop recording.